Simon, as VAR takes all the headlines again, and it does, are we ever going to get to a point where the technology is no longer the story?
One hopes so. But until you get subjectivity out of the conversation, it's never going to be. It's now the hobby horse of sections of the media. It is now the default setting to look for any incidents with VAR and scrutinise it and turn it. The expression clear and obvious is now a stick to hit VAR with, because clear and obvious is now becoming subjective, because ultimately what's clear and obvious to one person may not be clear and obvious to another. So then you're into the subjectivity of clear and obvious. Now, I mean, I think Gary O'Neill is a very sensible lad.
He's more measured than Arteta,
yeah, because I think anyone that follows him behind Arteta is going to have learnt the lesson and realise that there was a slight reaction, besides the ridiculousness of being supported by Arsenal, towards the manager, and the consequences have yet to be visited upon him. I'm not entirely sure I concur with the view that it impacts his reputation as a manager, because this time last year he wasn't even a manager, wasn't even being considered a manager, he was learning his trade. But I get the general perspective of outcomes. You might want to be in the opponent's penalty box at the end of every game rather than your own constantly. You might not be falling foul of some of these decisions. But I do get that there has been some decisions that have caused him to have reactions to it. And if the PGMOL officials are constantly apologising and telling him that they've gotten it wrong, or the officials full stop, not the PGMOL officials, but the officials full stop are telling him that they've gotten it wrong and they apologise for red cards not being delivered and so on and so forth, then you're going to have this element of frustration. I mean, look, the on-field decisions, you've got there's a desire to empower the on-field decision-making process. So without VAR, that first penalty still stands, because the on-field referee made a decision. The second penalty, the on-field referee did not make a decision. VAR intervened, and the on-field referee still has the choice. He still has the gift. So if that situation is now being altered by VAR, giving him a choice. Now, what people will say is VAR shouldn't intervene. I concur to some extent. I've always believed that VAR is a resource that should be called for, not necessarily interacting. So a referee should referee the game in front of him and then call for VAR. And if referees don't call for it repeatedly, and repeatedly digital interventions could have changed the direction, then you've got a situation. But in this situation, we go back to the on-field referee. The on-field referee, with new information available to him, rather than that moment, he decided that it wasn't a penalty for the second penalty. VAR intervenes because they perceive the subjective term, clear and obvious, is worthy of their intervention. It then throws it back to the on-field referee. If the on-field referee is comfortable and confident with what he saw, and then supported by digital imagery, then he should have continued with his original on-field decision. The challenge is that what do you want VAR to be?
Yeah.
What is it you want the outcome to be? And Gary is making observations about the repeated nature. First and foremost, it would help if players didn't feel the necessity, including his own, to throw themselves to the ground at every single tiny, minuscule touch that when you get inside a penalty box. That might help the decision-making process. But again, we're in a territory where VAR is going to consistently and constantly be the focus of every single situation where it intervenes, and there's some degree of interpretation. And the argument will be, I mean, last night you got a defender and you've got an attacker in Freddie Ljungberg, and you've got Jamie Carragher on Sky, and they're both coming to a different decision. So then tell me about the answer about getting expertise that's played the game to give you a definitive outcome, because you've got an attacker looking at it from an attacker's point of view. You've got a defender. So what have you got to do? You've got to have a defender and an attacker in Stockley Park as the expertise on tap for the officials that have never kicked a ball and can't play the game.
So what's your message to Gary O'Neill this morning? We were fairly strident in what we thought about Arteta.
I think he's approached the subject matter in a reasonable outcome. I think the idea that he's not encouraging his players,
He's saying let's bring a bit more noise to it.
Well, what noise is it you want? Do you want 100% clear up? Is that what you're expecting? Are you expecting a completely error-free?
He wants to hear from them more this morning.
To do what? So that he can complain about when they tell them they might have got it wrong. Now, the red cards, they've the fact is you've got a communication line, and you've got a situation where they're copping to mistakes that they make, and mistakes will be made, and that's the unfortunate nature of the beast. The digital interventions have proven over the last 12 months, 18 months, 24 months to be more on the side of credit rather than a debit column. But it would appear that Wolves have had quite a few dubious decisions, aided and abetted by players diving in penalty boxes and potentially the subjectivity of VAR intervening. But again, it goes back to the on-field decision. The referee, they can't argue about the first penalty because the referee would have given it on-field and that would be the end of the discussion.
Yeah.
So what's the point of bringing VAR into the conversation? VAR is now the whipping boy for the conversation because VAR didn't intervene. Now, I would love to know what Gary O'Neill would have said with respect to Gary if those decisions had been in favour of Wolverhampton Wanderers. Would he have come on camera and said VAR isn't working?
No, of course.
It gave us penalties
that's
that
right.
we should, but they do not.
They don't.
So there's a lacking of integrity. If it goes your way,
Yeah.
you're silent. If it goes against you, you're vociferous. That can't be the way. If you want to advance the game, if you want to be in this camp of suggesting that you need to have VAR working at a higher level, when it goes your way, and you know it's gone your way, and you still think it's flawed, then why don't you say it? Because they won't.
They won't. And it's exactly the same as we said about Arteta. If Arsenal had 1-2-1 up at Newcastle that day, we wouldn't have heard from him.
Of course. And therein lies the hypocrisy. I understand the reasons why.
So what's the message? Get on with it. All of you, get on with it.
Well, I think the referees, I mean, they can't keep coming out and apologising for getting things wrong. Of course they can if they keep on doing it, and people will be pleased with the apology because that's the society that we live in. We need an apology for everything. But for God's sake, stop making the decisions that require you to have an apology. If you're going to apologise after the event, don't create... When it's a subjective decision, they're not going to apologise for those two penalties. They are subjective, and there's an element of the laws need to be interpreted in a certain way.
You don't agree with him when he says decisions are now impacting reputation and livelihoods?
Well, I would make the argument that over the course of a season, you get an opportunity to be on the receiving end of good and bad luck, right? And you've got 15 points and reputation. I mean, I noticed when I saw on the transcript I saw, and I was quite disappointed to see this. The first thing he said was about his own reputation, and I thought, here we go. That hasn't taken you long to get into the mode of being me, myself, and I as a manager, because the first thing he said was my reputation. Now that might be a transcript that was out of kilter with what actually happened, but if that was, why is it your reputation that's the most primary, first and foremost?
Yeah.
The club's finances, the players, the points, they all go hand in hand. Look, I still maintain, like you do, that there was an improvement in VAR against decision-making processes of years gone past. But I still think the issue lies with the on-field referees having the courage of their convictions to be able to stand by the decisions that they've made more readily than sometimes they do.
Yeah. Headlines being made this morning. Of course, there were 5 goals in that game, and Fulham won it by 3-2. But the headline's still the technology this Tuesday morning.
Jim White and Simon Jordan. Monday to Friday mornings from 10 on AM, on DAB, via the TalkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. TalkSPORT.